Oftentimes, when working with tables, it is necessary to combine two columns into one. For example, on this table, the first row contains the heading My Expenses. Since we don't need two columns in this row, let's go ahead and merge them. To do so, remove the second column in the first row. So here our first row, the open and closing tag, inside we have two columns. I am going to remove the second column, and the next we need to add the code print attributes to the first column and set the value to the code from attribute define the number of columns and cell should spend a file and refresh and it says you can see we have now merged the two columns into the first row. In certain cases, we may want to prevent text from wrapping onto the multiple line if there is not enough space in a cell to accommodate it in one line. To do this, we can attach a no-wrap attribute to the table column. To illustrate how this works, I will need to enter a block of text into any one of our rules inserted into the first column. Now what the text inserted in the file saved, I am going to refresh the page. You can see that the text is automatically forced onto the next line at the end of the row. Now if we add the no-wrap attribute, so this is the column that contains the text, I am going to add the no-wrap attributes. When I save the page and refresh, you can see that the text now appears on a single line. There is going to be a bit of scrolling because it's very long block of text. The table is automatically expanding to accommodate the entire block of text. We can use the background attribute to apply the background image to a table. For the purpose of this example, this is the image that we'll be using is the background. The image is called a JPG or PNG and it can be found in your download folder. Make sure you place the image in the same folder as your HTML file so we can use the relative file path. Now apply the background attributes to a table element and set it equal to the image. Now save the file and refresh. You can see that this image has now been applied as the background to the table. We can also apply the background attributes to just table rows and similarly to just the table column as well. We can align the content of a table. So using the TDI align attributes, for example, we'll place the attribute in the column holding the value 100 right along the text. So we can see that the value now shift to the right side of the column. The field line attributes can also be set to the left center in justified. In this section of the course, we are going to be creating an input form using HTML. A form is used to gather input from your user form and are the most common method of data collection from website visitor. The data that is inputted into the form can be stored into the database or submitted to an email address. Keep in mind that in order for a form to work and transmit the data, we need to use a programming language which communicate with our web browser. Later in this course, we will be exploring and working more with data processing from now is the HTML session of this course will only be creating the front end of the form. This is what the user sees through their web browser. Let's take a look at the example for a basic contact form on the web. Now on this form, the user is able to submit an inquiry directly to the website poster by completing the required field. For example, name, email, subject and message. If we try to submit a form without filling in any information, we can see a number of errors appears. So now let's explore how a form is processed once the user click and send button. First, the user completes the form and filled out the form field. Next, the data is transmitted to a script which validates the form. Validation includes checking to make sure data is accurate at a certain degree. Data validation is very important and can be done in the client-side programming language such as JavaScript and also in the server-side language such as the PHP. It is recommended that both are implemented. Keep in mind that the user can disable client-side validation by adjusting settings in their web browser. Server-side validation on the other hand cannot be avoided. We will be working with the both type of validation technique later in this course. Example of data validation types including checking email address formats, checking the length of the data type into a field. For example, the minimum amount of a character or the maximum amount of the character must be met in order to form the submission. Or perhaps checking the format of the phone number. This is not an exhaustive list and there are many different ways that it can be validated. Once the data is validated and the data is processed, the data can be inputted into a database. It can be transmitted to any email address or some other form of data pre-processing. On the other hand, if validation fails, the user typically sent back to the contract form page so the correction can be made. As a reminder, we will be working with the form data processing later in this course. For now, we'll begin with that course. In this lecture, we will be creating an HTML form. This is sample of the form we'll be creating. It's in an employment application form. It asks the user for some personal information. The form consists of text field, select menus, check boxes, radio button, text area, and submit and reset button. The form input and inputs label are organized into a table. So let's get started. You need to open the form HTML file in the download folder corresponding to this lecture. With the format HTML file open, you will notice that the basic structure is already set up. The code also contains a table with the two columns in the 9 row in the body. We will use this table for our form field. Let's preview the file just to make sure our table is visible and there is no error in that code. This is what your page should look like initially. Just an empty table. With our two columns in 9 rules, the first thing we need to do to create our form is insert our open and close form tabs. These tabs will contain all HTML code pertaining to our form fields such as text, input, select the menu, submission button and other form elements. It's very important to create the form tabs first, otherwise the form will not work. The form tag will encompass the entire table because all our form field will be contained within the table. The form tag also have the important attributes that we must define. First, it's a good practice to name the form so that if you create multiple forms on the same page, each can be distinguished from one another. We will name this form employment. Next, we need to instruct our browser on where to send this form data upon our submission. This is known as the form action. In our case, will be sending the data to a script which will instruct our web server on how the data should be processed. For the forward action, let's type in sending. We will create send in the section of this course. In addition to the action attributes, we must also specify the method of the data transmission. A form method tells the browser to submit the data through the post or the get command. For now, we will define the method is post. We will explore both these methods in more detail in the next lecture. In this lesson, we will conduct a quick overview of the difference between the post and get method of transmitting form data. This topic will be explained in much more detail in this section of the course. As we mentioned earlier in the course, the protocol facilitates communication between our web browser and the server. There are two types of methods that can be used to transmit data between the client and the server. This includes the getImport method. To get method request data from a specified resource and the post method submit data to the preprocessor to a specified resource. When using the get method, the name and the value pair from the form fields are set in the URL stream as shown in this example. Here we can see the values contained in the f name in the name field are attached to the end of the file name of our form action send. The post method on the other hand sends the name and values pair in the HTTP message body as shown in this example. Both the post and get method have unique properties that are specified to each one. We will start with the get method. Get requests can be cached. They remain in the web history. They should only be used to retrieve data. They have length restriction. They should never be used when transmitting sensitive data such as password, and they can be bookmarked. The post method on the other hand has no restriction on data link. Cannot be bookmarked, does not remain in browser history, and the requests are never crashed. With our form created, we can now start the inserting our input field. Let's start by entering our form heading followed by our form label for the two input field. In the first row and our first column we'll enter employment section. In the second row in the first column we'll enter the label for the first input field, first name, and in the third row the first column last thing. With the label entered, we can now start putting in our field. The first name field will require a basic text input field. The HTML code for an input field is as follows. It does require a closing tag. The input field also allows different attributes. First, we need to assign a name. This will be important later in this course when we make the script functional and transmit the data to our script. Your name should correspond to the field label, so we will just abbreviate the first name and we will call it enter name. Try to the avoid capital letter special character in the name because that will cause complication later on when we attach this form to our script and retrieve the data from these foreign fields. So just keep the name lowercase and as simple as possible. Next we can assign a max length attribute to make sure the user cannot type in more than a certain amount of characters. So for example, say most first name would not exceed the 50 characters, so that's how we would prevent more than 50 characters from being typed into the input field, and that's it for the first text input. Now let's copy this block of code and paste it into this column for the last name. So we will change the name to the all name and that's it. Let's go ahead and save the file and make sure that our first two form fields and are our visible. So that's what they should look like this. Up to this point we have the form label, first name and last name. We have the title of the form, employment application, and we have our first two text input fields.
Like, subscribe and press the bell icon of Getsitement for future updates.